The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling wheat fields of the Peterson Ranch as Jacob Peterson guided his horse along the property line, checking the irrigation channels that had made his land the most prosperous in all of Dakota Territory. It was September 1887, and the harvest season was approaching, a time that would determine whether this year's profits would allow him to expand his holdings even further. At 35, Jacob had built an empire from nothing. He owned 12,000 acres of prime farmland, employed over 40 workers during harvest season, and his grain supplied markets as far east as Chicago. The two-story ranch house he had built for himself stood as a testament to his success, with its wraparound porch, modern conveniences, and imported furnishings that rivaled anything found in the growing cities. Yet for all his material success, Jacob Peterson was profoundly lonely. He had dedicated every waking hour to building his fortune, and somewhere along the way, he had forgotten to build a life to go with it. As he approached the main road that bordered his property, Jacob noticed a figure stumbling along the dusty path, a young woman carrying what appeared to be a small bundle. Her dress was tattered and travel-worn, her hair disheveled, and even from a distance, he could see that she was struggling to stay upright. Jacob spurred his horse forward, his natural compassion overriding his usual caution around strangers. As he drew closer, he could see that the woman was probably in her early 20s, with auburn hair and green eyes that held a mixture of desperation and fierce determination. The bundle in her arms, he realized with shock, was a baby. "Ma'am," Jacob called out, dismounting from his horse, "are you in need of assistance?" The young woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed to assess his character in an instant. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion, "I need help. My baby. We haven't eaten in 2 days." Jacob could see that she was telling the truth. Her face was gaunt with hunger, and the infant in her arms was unnaturally quiet, the kind of stillness that spoke of weakness rather than peaceful sleep. "Of course," Jacob said immediately, "my ranch house is just over that rise. We can get you food and water and a place to rest. I don't have money to pay you," the woman said, her pride evident even in her desperate circumstances. "I'm not asking for payment," Jacob replied gently. "Come, let me help you onto my horse." As Jacob helped the young woman mount his horse, he noticed several things that would prove significant. Later, her hands, though dirty and work-worn, showed the calluses of someone educated in fine needlework. Her speech, despite her exhaustion, carried the refined accent of someone raised with education. And most importantly, she clutched not just her baby, but a sealed envelope that she guarded as carefully as she did her child. The ride to the ranch house took only a few minutes, but Jacob could feel the woman swaying with weakness behind him. When they reached the house, he helped her down and guided her toward the front porch, where his housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, was hanging laundry. "Mrs. O'Brien," Jacob called out, "we have guests who are in urgent need of food and care." Molly O'Brien, a stout Irish woman in her 50s who had been with Jacob for 3 years, took one look at the young woman and immediately went into action. "Poor dear, you look half-starved. Come inside immediately. I'll get some broth started and prepare a room." As they entered the ranch house, the young woman's eyes widened at the comfortable furnishings and obvious prosperity of Jacob's home. The front parlor contained a piano, shelves lined with leather-bound books, and furniture that spoke of both wealth and good taste. "What's your name?" Jacob asked gently as Mrs. O'Brien bustled about preparing food. "Mary," the young woman replied, settling carefully into a chair with her baby. "Mary Collins, and this is my daughter Emma. Where are you traveling from, Miss Collins?" Mary hesitated, and Jacob noticed her grip tighten on the envelope she carried. "From the east. We've been traveling for a long time." Mrs. O'Brien appeared with a bowl of warm broth and a piece of fresh bread. "Here now, you eat this slowly. Don't want to make yourself sick after going without." As Mary ate with careful restraint, obviously forcing herself not to devour the food despite her hunger, Jacob studied her more carefully. Everything about her suggested someone who had once lived very differently than her current circumstances indicated. "Miss Collins," Jacob said carefully, "I don't mean to pry, but are you traveling alone? Is there no one expecting you? Mary's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. There's no one, Mr. Peterson. Jacob Peterson. And if you don't mind my asking, what are your plans? Where are you headed? I was hoping to reach California, Mary said quietly. I thought there might be opportunities there, work I could do to support Emma and myself. Jacob considered this. California was still hundreds of miles away, and winter was approaching. A woman alone with a baby would face tremendous hardships on such a journey. Miss Collins, forgive me for being direct, but you're in no condition to continue traveling. You're exhausted, and the baby needs care and stability. Why don't you stay here for a few days, at least until you've recovered your strength? Mary looked up at him with surprise. Mr. Peterson, you don't know anything about me. Why would you make such an offer to a stranger? Jacob smiled. Because you're clearly a woman of good character who's fallen on hard times. I have more space in this house than I know what to do with, and Mrs. O'Brien would welcome the company. That I would, Mrs. O'Brien agreed warmly. It gets lonely out here with just Mr. Peterson and myself, a baby. In the house would brighten things considerably. Mary clutched the envelope tighter and looked back and forth between Jacob and Mrs. O'Brien. I appreciate your kindness, but I couldn't impose without being able to contribute something in return. What skills do you have? Jacob asked practically. I can read and write, do arithmetic, and keep accounts, Mary replied. I'm skilled with a needle, both for mending and fine embroidery. I can cook, though not as well as Mrs. O'Brien, I'm sure. Jacob's eyes lit up with interest. Actually, Miss Collins, I've been needing someone to help with the ranch's bookkeeping. The operation has grown too large for me to manage all the financial records myself. If you're truly skilled with numbers, perhaps we could arrange a fair exchange room and board for you and your daughter in return for clerical work. Mary stared at him as if he had offered her salvation itself. You would trust me with your business records. Mrs. O'Brien is an excellent judge of character. Jacob replied, and she's already decided you're trustworthy. That's good enough for me. As the evening progressed, Mrs. O'Brien prepared a room for Mary and baby Emma, while Jacob found himself increasingly curious about this mysterious young woman, who spoke like a lady but traveled like a refugee. There was clearly more to her story than she was willing to reveal, but he sensed that whatever secrets she carried, they came from pain rather than malice. After Mary had retired to her room with Emma, Jacob sat on his front porch, smoking his evening pipe and reflecting on the day's events. It had been a long time since his house had felt alive, with the presence of others, and he found the change surprisingly welcome. What he didn't know was that upstairs, Mary Collins was sitting by the window, still clutching the sealed envelope that contained secrets that would change everything about Jacob Peterson's carefully ordered life. The letter bore the handwriting of someone Mary had thought was lost to her forever, and its contents would soon reveal that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from what we seek, but from who finds us when we need it most. As Mary finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted but safe for the first time in months, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the kindness of strangers. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to trust Jacob Peterson with the truth about who she was and why. She was running. Tonight, it was enough to know that her daughter was warm and fed, and that perhaps their long journey toward a new life was finally beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Mary Collins had arrived at the Peterson Ranch, and her presence had transformed the daily rhythm of life in ways that surprised everyone, especially Jacob. The ranch house, which had once felt like an elaborate but empty monument to his success, now hummed with the sounds of domestic life, Mary's gentle humming as she worked on the account, books, baby Emma's occasional cries and gurgles, and the comfortable conversations that filled the evening hours. Mary had proven to be everything she had claimed and more. Her skill with numbers was remarkable, and she had already identified several inefficiencies in Jacob's operation that would save him hundreds of dollars. She had also revealed a talent for organization, systematically improving the ranch's record-keeping in ways that impressed even Jacob's experienced foreman. But despite their growing friendship and the comfortable routine they had established, Jacob sensed that Mary was still carrying secrets. She never spoke of her past beyond vague references to back east, and she continued to guard that sealed envelope with a vigilance that suggested its contents were of paramount importance. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the Dakota landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Jacob was reviewing the updated financial records in his study when he heard raised voices. From the front of the house, through his window, he could see two men on horseback, strangers whose bearing and expensive clothes marked them as men of means, but whose aggressive posture suggested their visit was not a social call. "Mrs. O'Brien," Jacob called out. "Who are those men at our door?" But before Mrs. O'Brien could answer, he heard Mary's voice, sharp with fear. "No, I told you. I don't know anything about that." Jacob immediately strode to the front parlor, where he found Mary backing away from the two strangers while clutching baby Emma protectively. The men were middle-aged, well-dressed, and had the hard eyes of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. "Gentlemen," Jacob said firmly, positioning himself between the strangers and Mary, "I'm Jacob Peterson, owner of this ranch. What business do you have here?" The taller of the two men, who wore expensive wool coat and carried himself with obvious authority, looked Jacob up and down with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Hamilton Ross, attorney for the Whitmore family of Boston. This woman is harboring property that belongs to my clients." "Property?" Jacob's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I see a young woman and her baby, not property." "You misunderstand," the second man interjected. He was shorter but broader, with the look of someone hired for enforcement rather than legal expertise. "We're not talking about the woman herself. We're talking about certain documents that were stolen from the Whitmore estate." Jacob looked at Mary, whose face had gone completely pale. "Miss Collins, do you know what these men are talking about?" Mary's hands were shaking as she clutched Emma tighter. "Jacob, there are things about my past that I haven't told you. Whatever they are," Jacob said steadily, "we can discuss them after these gentlemen leave my property. Now see here," Hamilton Ross said sharply, "this woman is a thief and a fraud. Her real name is Mary Whitmore, and she has stolen valuable documents from her deceased husband's estate." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. Mary Whitmore, he had heard that name before. The Whitmores were one of Boston's most prominent banking families, their wealth legendary even in the distant Dakota Territory. "Mary," Jacob said quietly, "is this true?" Mary's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "My name is Mary Whitmore Collins. I was married to Thomas Whitmore III, and these men work for his family. But I am not a thief. You stole documents that prove the illegitimate disposition of estate assets," Ross accused. "Documents that you have no legal right to possess." "I have every right," Mary replied, her voice growing stronger. "Those documents prove that I was Thomas's legal wife, and that Emma is his legitimate daughter and heir. The Whitmore family has been trying to deny our existence since Thomas died." Jacob's mind raced as he processed this information. "What kind of documents?" Mary looked at him with eyes that pleaded for understanding. "Jacob, the envelope I've been carrying, it contains my marriage certificate, Emma's birth certificate, and Thomas's will, documents that prove Emma is entitled to inherit from the Whitmore estate." "Worthless papers," the shorter man said dismissively. "The marriage was never recognized by the family, and the will was written when Thomas was mentally incompetent." "Thomas was perfectly competent when he married me," Mary said fiercely. "He chose to marry beneath his station because he loved me, not because of any mental deficiency." Jacob was beginning to understand the situation. "Let me guess, the Whitmore family doesn't want to acknowledge a marriage that would entitle Mary and Emma to a portion of the family fortune." "The woman was a servant in the household," Ross explained with obvious distaste. "Thomas was going through a difficult period after his first wife's death. The family cannot allow the estate to be diminished by the claims of every opportunistic servant who took advantage of a grieving man." "I was not every opportunistic servant," Mary said, her voice carrying the authority that Jacob had sensed but never heard fully expressed. "I was Thomas's governess, hired to care for his two children from his first marriage. I was educated at the Hartford Female Seminary, and I came from a respectable family that had fallen on hard times." Jacob studied Mary's face, seeing her now in an entirely different light. The refinement he had noticed, the education evident in her speech, the skill with numbers and letters, it all made sense now. Even if that's true, Ross continued, the fact remains that you removed valuable documents from the Whitmore estate. Without permission, that constitutes theft under Massachusetts law. I removed documents that belonged to my daughter, Mary corrected. Documents that prove her legitimacy and her inheritance rights. Jacob looked at the envelope Mary still clutched, understanding now why she had guarded it so carefully. What exactly do the Whitmores want? They want the documents returned, Ross said bluntly, and they want this woman to renounce any claim to the Whitmore name or estate in exchange for a modest settlement that will allow her to disappear quietly, and if she refuses, the shorter. Man smiled unpleasantly. Then we'll have her arrested for theft and fraud. A woman with a criminal record would have difficulty claiming inheritance rights. Mary's face was white with fear, but her voice remained steady. They've been chasing me across the country for 6 months. Every time I try to find legal representation, they use their influence to intimidate lawyers into refusing my case. Jacob felt anger building in his chest. So you've been running from these men all this time? I've been trying to reach California, where I hope to find lawyers who weren't influenced by East Coast money, Mary explained. But with Emma to care for and no resources, the offer stands, Ross interrupted. $5,000 and safe passage to anywhere she wants to go in exchange for the documents and a signed renunciation of all claims. Jacob looked at Mary, who was clearly torn between the security of the offer and the justice of her daughter's rightful inheritance. What would Emma inherit if these documents were validated? Potentially millions, Ross admitted reluctantly. Thomas Whitmore III was entitled to 1/4 of the family banking fortune, and they're offering $5,000 in exchange for millions, Jacob observed. How generous. Mr. Peterson, Ross said, his tone becoming threatening. I would advise you not to involve yourself in this matter. The Whitmore family has considerable resources and influence that extend far beyond Massachusetts. Jacob smiled grimly. Gentlemen, you're in Dakota territory now, not Boston. Out here, we judge people by their character and their actions, not by their family connections or their ability to intimidate. He stepped closer to the two men, his posture making it clear that he was prepared to use force if necessary. Now, I'm going to ask you politely to leave my property. Miss Collins is my guest, and she will remain under my protection for as long as she chooses to stay. Ross and his companion exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. This isn't over, Peterson. The Whitmore family doesn't give up easily, neither do I. Jacob replied calmly. After the men had left, Jacob turned to Mary, who had collapsed into a chair with Emma still in her arms. Mary, why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Because I was afraid, she whispered, afraid that you would either be intimidated by their threats or tempted by their money. I couldn't risk losing the first safe haven Emma and I have found. Jacob knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle but firm. Mary Whitmore Collins, you and your daughter are under my protection now, but I need to see those documents, and I need to know everything about your situation. Mary looked into his eyes and saw something that gave her hope. For the first time in months, a man who was prepared to fight for justice, regardless of the cost. With trembling hands, she reached for the envelope that had been her lifeline and her burden. Don't lose this letter, she said, echoing words she had spoken to herself countless times during her long journey. Everything depends on what's written here. As Jacob took the envelope, both of them understood that this moment would change everything, not just about Mary's fight for her daughter's inheritance, but about the unexpected alliance that was forming between a wealthy rancher and a fugitive widow in the vast Dakota territory. That evening, by the light of oil lamps in Jacob's study, the documents that Mary had carried across half the country were finally revealed in their full significance. Jacob read through each paper with the careful attention of a man who understood that legal documents could be the difference between justice and injustice, between security and destitution. The marriage certificate was elaborate and official, bearing the seal of a Boston church and signed by prominent witnesses. Thomas Whitmore E's signature was bold and confident, showing no signs of the mental incompetence his family claimed. The date showed that he had married Mary Collins on June 15, 1885, barely 6 months after his first wife's death. Emma's birth certificate was equally legitimate, clearly establishing her as Thomas Whitmore E's daughter, born in lawful wedlock on March 20th, 1886. But it was the will that proved most interesting and most damaging to the Whitmore family's positio. N. Mary, Jacob said, looking up from the documents, "This will is extraordinary. Thomas didn't just leave you a portion of his inheritance. He made specific provisions to ensure that Emma would be educated and provided for until adulthood. And he explicitly acknowledged that his family might try to contest the legitimacy of your marriage." Mary nodded, her eyes red from crying but her voice steady. "Thomas knew his family well. He told me they would never accept our marriage because I had been in service, regardless of my education or background. That's why he was so careful about the documentation. And this provision here," Jacob continued, pointing to a specific paragraph, "where he establishes a trust fund specifically for Emma's education and support that suggests he was thinking clearly about the future and planning for contingencies." "Thomas was brilliant," Mary said sadly. "He built the bank's Western expansion program and negotiated deals that made the family millions. They benefited from his intelligence for years, but they want to claim he was incompetent the moment he did something they disapproved of." Mrs. O'Brien, who had been quietly serving tea, spoke up with characteristic directness, "Begging your pardon, but it seems to me that the real issue isn't whether Mr. Thomas was competent. It's whether these rich folks can get away with stealing from a baby because her mother used to work for them." Jacob smiled at his housekeeper's plain-spoken assessment. "Mrs. O'Brien is right. This isn't really about legal technicalities, it's about power and greed." "But what can we do?" Mary asked. "They have unlimited resources, political connections, and the ability to intimidate anyone who tries to help me. I've been running for 6 months, and they've found me every time I've tried to establish legal representation." Jacob leaned back in his chair, his mind working through possibilities. "Mary, what you need is legal representation that can't be intimidated or bought off. Someone who has nothing to lose and everything to gain from taking on a case like this. Do you know such a person?" "Actually, I might," Jacob replied thoughtfully. "There's a lawyer in Fargo named Daniel Mackenzie. He's young, ambitious, and has a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers won't touch. More importantly, he's built his practice specifically on challenging Eastern money and corporate power." Mary's eyes lit up with the first hope she had felt in months. "Do you think he would consider representing me?" "I think he would consider it a privilege," Jacob said, "especially if he understood the precedent this case could set. If wealthy families can simply ignore legal marriages and legitimate inheritance rights when it suits them, what protection do any of us have?" Mrs. O'Brien was nodding approvingly. "That's the spirit, Mr. Jacob. These high-end mighty folks need to learn that justice isn't just for people who can afford it. But it will be expensive," Mary said practically. "Legal representation of that caliber, especially for a case that could last months or even years." "Mary," Jacob interrupted gently, "I want to propose something. I'll fund your legal representation and any associated costs in exchange for a partnership agreement." Mary looked confused. "What kind of partnership?" Jacob stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the vast expanse of his ranch. "You've already proven invaluable in managing my business records. Your education, intelligence, and attention to detail have improved my operation in ways I didn't even realize were possible." He turned back to face her. "I'm proposing that you become my official business partner. You'll receive a salary and a percentage of the ranch's profits, which will give you independent income while your legal case proceeds." "Jacob, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept such an arrangement." "You barely know me." "I know enough," Jacob said firmly. "I know you're honest, intelligent, and hardworking. I know you're a devoted mother who's willing to fight for her daughter's future. And I know that in 3 weeks, you've done more to improve my business operations than I managed in 3 years." Mrs. O'Brien beamed at Mary. "He's right, dear. You've brought organization and efficiency to this place that we never had before. And if I may say so, you've brought life back to this house in ways that go beyond business." Mary looked back and forth between Jacob and Mrs. O'Brien, overwhelmed by their support, but still uncertain. What if the Whitmores retaliate against you? What if they try to damage your business or reputation? Jacob laughed. "Mary, I own 12,000 acres of the most productive farmland in Dakota Territory. I employ dozens of people, and I provide grain that feeds thousands of families. The Whitmores might have influence in Boston, but out here, my word carries more weight than their money. Besides," he continued, "I've been looking for a worthy fight. Building this ranch gave me purpose for years, but lately I've been wondering what the point of all this success is if I don't use it to make a difference." Mary stood up and walked to the window where Jacob had been standing, looking out at the land that had become her refuge. "If I accept your offer, it won't just be a business arrangement, will it? We'll be challenging a system that's designed to protect wealth and privilege at the expense of justice." "Yes," Jacob agreed. "We will. And if we lose, I could end up with nothing, and you could be left with a damaged reputation and legal bills that serve no purpose." "That's possible," Jacob acknowledged. Mary turned back to face him, and Jacob saw in her eyes the steel that had carried her across the country in defense of her daughter's rights. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Peterson. But I want to be clear about what this means." She walked back to the desk and picked up the documents that represented Emma's future. "This isn't just about money or inheritance rights. This is about whether a woman and child can be erased from history simply because their existence is inconvenient to powerful people." "Exactly," Jacob said. "And it's about whether justice can exist when it challenges wealth and established power." "Yes." Mary smiled for the first time since the Whitmore representatives had appeared at the ranch. "Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget." As Jacob shook hands with his new partner, both of them understood that they were embarking on something that went far beyond a business arrangement or even a legal case. They were challenging a system that assumed money and status could override truth and justice, and they were doing it in the belief that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Outside, the Dakota wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter ahead. But inside the ranch house, three people, a successful rancher, a fugitive widow, and an Irish housekeeper, were planning a battle that would test everything they believed about justice, courage, and the possibility of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary power. The letter that Mary had carried so carefully was no longer just evidence of her daughter's inheritance rights. It had become the foundation of an alliance that would prove that sometimes the most important victories come not from those who have everything to gain, but from those who are willing to risk everything they have for what they believe is right. 6 months later, the courtroom in Fargo was packed with spectators who had come to witness the conclusion of what newspapers had dubbed the Dakota Territory inheritance case. The legal battle between Mary Whitmore Collins and the Whitmore banking family had captured public attention far beyond the bounds of the territory, becoming a symbol of the struggle between Eastern money and frontier justice. Jacob Peterson sat in the front row, watching as his partner and friend prepared for what they all hoped would be the final day of testimony. Daniel Mackenzie, the young lawyer Jacob had recommended, had proven himself more than capable of matching the legal firepower that the Whitmore family had brought to bear. But the case had been hard fought, with moments when victory seemed uncertain. The Whitmores had spared no expense in their efforts to discredit Mary's claims. They had brought in handwriting experts to challenge the authenticity of the documents, character witnesses to testify about Thomas Whitmore's allegedly diminished mental capacity, and legal scholars to argue that marriages between people of different social classes were inherently suspect. But Daniel Mackenzie had systematically dismantled each of their arguments. He had demonstrated that the documents were genuine, that Thomas Whitmore had been conducting complex business transactions right up until his death, and that love and marriage knew no social boundaries under the law. More importantly, he had painted a picture of a wealthy family willing to destroy the lives of a woman and child, rather than share their fortune according to their deceased relatives' clear wishes. "Your Honor," Mackenzie was saying in his closing argument, This case is fundamentally about whether the law protects all citizens equally, or whether it can be bent to serve the convenience of the wealthy and powerful. Judge Harrison Wilson, a man in his 60s who had built his reputation on fairness and integrity, listened intently as Mackenzie continued. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Thomas Whitmore III was a competent adult when he chose to marry Mary Collins. He was a loving father when Emma was born, and he was a thoughtful man planning for his family's future when he wrote his will. Mackenzie gestured toward Mary, who sat with quiet dignity beside her attorney. The Whitmore family asks you to believe that one of Boston's most successful bankers suddenly became incompetent the moment he chose love over social expectation. They ask you to invalidate legal documents that meet every standard of authenticity because those documents are inconvenient to their financial interests. Hamilton Ross, the Whitmore family attorney, had made his closing argument earlier, emphasizing the family's grief over Thomas's death and their concern about protecting the estate from fraudulent claims. But Jacob could see that the judge was unimpressed by arguments that seemed to prioritize money over justice. Most importantly, Mackenzie concluded, this case is about Emma Whitmore Collins, an innocent child whose very existence is being denied by people who should be celebrating her as the continuation of their family line. She has the right to know her heritage, to benefit from her father's love and provision, and to grow up with the security that her father intended for her. When Mackenzie sat down, Judge Wilson took only a few minutes to review his notes before rendering his verdict. In the matter of Collins versus Whitmore, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. This court finds that the marriage between Thomas Whitmore III and Mary Collins was legal and valid. Emma Whitmore Collins is the legitimate daughter and heir of Thomas Whitmore III. A murmur of excitement rippled through the courtroom, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court finds that the will of Thomas Whitmore III is valid and enforceable. The trust fund established for Emma's education and support is hereby recognized, and the Whitmore family is ordered to comply with all provisions of the will. Within 30 days, Jacob felt a surge of triumph as he watched Mary's face transform. With relief and joy, she had won not just a legal victory, but validation of her marriage, her dignity, and her daughter's future. But Judge Wilson had more to say. This court is deeply troubled by the Whitmore family's attempts to deny the existence of a legitimate marriage and to disinherit a child, based solely on considerations of social class and financial convenience. He looked directly at Hamilton Ross and the Whitmore family representatives. Such behavior is not only legally indefensible, but morally reprehensible. The court awards additional damages to Miss Collins for the costs and hardships imposed by the family's unconscionable conduct. When the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in applause. Mary was crying with relief, Daniel Mackenzie was beaming with professional pride, and Jacob felt a satisfaction deeper than any business success had ever provided. Outside the courthouse, as newspaper reporters clamored for statements, Mary stood, with Emma in her arms, finally able to look toward the future without fear. "What will you do now?" asked a reporter from the territorial newspaper. Mary looked at Jacob, who stood beside her with the protective presence that had sustained her through the long legal battle. "Emma and I will return to the Peterson Ranch, where we have found not just safety, but a true partnership and friendship. And the inheritance?" Another reporter pressed. "Will provide Emma with the education and opportunities her father wanted for her," Mary replied. "But more importantly, this case has proven that justice exists for everyone, not just those born to privilege." Jacob stepped forward slightly. "Miss Collins has become an invaluable partner in my ranch operation. We're planning to expand into agricultural innovation and education projects that will benefit the entire territory." As they walked away from the courthouse, Mrs. O'Brien, who had come to Fargo for the verdict, beamed at them both. "I knew from the first day that everything would work out. You two were meant to be a team." That evening, in their hotel in Fargo, Jacob and Mary sat discussing their plans for the future. Emma, now 13 months old, was crawling energetically around the room, her laughter filling the space with joy. "Jacob," Mary said, "I need you to know how grateful I am. Not just for the money you invested in the legal case, but for believing in justice when it would have been easier to turn away. Mary, Jacob replied, "You've given me something more valuable than gratitude. You've given me purpose. For years, I built wealth without understanding why. Now I know that success means nothing unless it's used to make the world more just." Mary smiled. "So what comes next for the Peterson-Collins partnership?" Jacob grinned. "Next, we build something that would make your Thomas proud, a legacy that proves love and justice are more powerful than money and status." As they watched Emma play with the simple wooden toys that Jacob had carved for her, both understood that their unlikely alliance had created something beautiful. A family built not on blood or tradition, but on shared values, mutual respect, and the courage to fight for what was right. The letter that Mary had carried across the country had indeed changed everything, not just by proving Emma's inheritance rights, but by bringing together two people who discovered that the greatest wealth came from using their resources in service of justice and love. In the months that followed, the Peterson Ranch became known throughout Dakota Territory not just for its agricultural success, but as a place where fairness and opportunity flourished. Emma grew up surrounded by the love of two people who had chosen to become family, and who had proven that sometimes the most important victories come from those willing to risk everything for what they believe is right.